right, welcome everyone. Come on in. We're going to give folks just a few minutes to get settled, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Marjorie Bentley. I'm a Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago. I'm originally from a fairly small town in North Georgia, and I've been in Chicago now for 17 years, which is a long time. But I made that transition from pretty small town North Georgia to third largest city in the United States. And I'm always happy to talk about it. But I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, John Palmer at Vanderbilt next to introduce himself.
Yeah, well, good evening, everyone. My name is John Palmer, a Senior Assistant Director of Admissions at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm also a rural student myself. I grew up in the rural South and lower Midwest my entire life and transitioned to undergrad, not at Vanderbilt, but actually right down the road here in Nashville. So have some of that experience similar to Marjorie. Excited to be with y'all this evening. I'll turn things over to Beth.
Good evening. Thanks so much, John Palmer, and I'm so glad to have everyone join us. My name is Beth Weiser. I serve as Assistant Vice Provost for University Admissions at The Ohio State University. I, too, grew up in a small town in central Iowa, a town of about 11,000 people. And so I know the benefits of being able to be in that kind of environment. So glad that you're joining us today. And I'll turn things over to Drew.
Thank you, Beth. Hi, everyone. My name is Drew Goodwin. I'm a Senior Assistant Director of Admissions at Colby College. I'm a first-gen college student originally from Central Pennsylvania. I'm coming at you from my apartment in Oakland, Maine, which is a small town of about 6,000 people located right outside of Waterville, where Colby is located. So very excited to have you all with us today, and I'll turn it back over to Marjorie as we get going.
Okay, thank you all. Before we jump into the specifics of each of our different schools and why they're such wonderful places to live and learn, we want to talk a little bit about STARS itself. So the STARS College Network, if you are tuning in for your first webinar, your first Zoom session with us, we are the small town and rural school students college network. We are designed to provide resources and opportunities for students from rural and small towns to learn more about college, and then to thrive at college. So it's really holistic, getting started, how do you transition to college, and then how do you thrive once you are at college. We are hosting a bunch of different webinars, as you can see. We also have a ton of resources on our website, including free math curriculum through Schoolhouse and Khan Academy. We're hopefully in the next year also coming to you, visiting your high schools, your hometowns, your communities, and bringing you to us. So we're going to be hosting a lot of on-campus programs at our different institutions, whether that's a flying program or a drive-in or a summer program, giving you the opportunity to really see yourself on our college campuses, eating in the dining hall, sleeping in the dorms, taking classes. There's going to be a really wide variety of opportunities for everyone to engage with the STARS College Network and all 16 of the different schools that are in the network. So this is the slide that kind of shows all of those different schools. Each of our webinars for the next couple of months is going to highlight all of these different schools. So if you're curious, if you're interested and you want to learn more about any of them, keep tuning in. We're going to be hosting webinars every single month, the first Tuesday of the month.
That's just a little bit about Colby, but I am going to go ahead and transition us into talking a little bit more about the holistic review process, which is our main topic for this evening. And I know that some of my colleagues talk a little bit about holistic review, but I want to simply define what holistic review is and what it is not. So holistic review is going to consider every aspect of a student. It's going to consider your personal background, your academic and extracurricular achievements, things like recommendation letters, essays, including your Common App or Coalition personal statement. And this is pretty standard practice at most selective to highly selective schools. I think we've all mentioned we do all use a holistic review process. And this is going to take everything and every piece of information you give us into account. So when you're filling out your application and with this holistic review process in mind, it pays you dividends to tell us as much as possible about you, because you never know what a school might find valuable about you, right? So knowing about your background and about the town that you grew up in and the experiences that you have can be so valuable in that process. So oversharing is hard to do on an application, on an admissions application process in a holistic review context. Now, this is opposed to the admissions index, which some typically less selective institutions, but increasingly they are also using the holistic review process. And this really is just looking at your GPA, your number of academic classes, and your test scores. And there are some schools that might have a hybrid evaluation process where if you are test optional, they do consider a more holistic review process. But with the shift to test optional, less and less, fewer and fewer schools are using this admissions index. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about the academic portions of this. So just, things like your transcript, your school profile, letters of recommendation, and then we'll get a little bit to testing. But on the transcript side, everyone knows that your transcript is going to be part of your application. You want to make sure you're working with either your college counseling office or your guidance office or the administrator in your principal's office to get that sent. That's going to be probably your very first step. And this really gives us this understanding of your past and current academic performance and future potential. And so we're looking at your grades, but we're also looking at your curriculum. And we're looking at your curriculum from a very contextualized basis. So I often work with students who are coming from schools in Maine. Maine is a very rural state. And sometimes they only have 3 or 4 AP classes offered if they're at a really small high school. So they're not being penalized for only taking 2 or 3 of those because they didn't have access to the 30 or so that some other schools might have. So I'm contextualizing your rigor and your curriculum within what you've had access to. So I'm not, penalizing you for not having access to things that would be silly. And we know about this context from the school profile, which typically if a school is sending a transcript, they'll also send a little sheet along, or at least some contextual information about, again, what opportunities are available. So this is not something that you usually have to specifically request, but it never hurts just to ask. So this will include information about the demographics of your school, graduation data, what classes are offered, what extracurricular activities might be offered, things like that. So again, smaller schools in more rural areas might not have as many extracurricular things going on just because there's less students, but really it's letting us know a little bit more about that context as well. Now, additionally, letters of recommendation can be very important. I know that a few of us here tonight will use letters of recommendation. And these basically tell us things about you in the classroom that your grades do not. So your grades tell us about your achievement. Your letters of recommendation are going to tell us a bit more about how do you act in the classroom, right? Are you a good citizen within the classroom space? Are you asking good questions? Are you moving the conversation forward? Are you on task and on topic? Do you help your peers when they're stuck on something? Things like that. So really thinking about, which teachers know me best, what classes do I thrive in? And the class that you thrive in might not always be the class that you got the best grade in. There's plenty of classes that I in high school got A+ in, but that I did not thrive in terms of like the showing my aptitude and my understanding. So thinking about which teachers know you the best to give you that more kind of, citizen of the classroom perspective. But we're also going to talk a little bit about testing. And I know I've talked a little bit about how we are shifting, a lot of schools are shifting away from using testing, or at least towards a test optional policy. So like I did mention, Colby is a test optional institution. But if a school has this, it means that they allow you to determine whether or not you would like to submit your test scores. So letting us know, hey, I'm really proud of these test scores. I want them considered as part of my application. Or if you were like me and you were like, an AP student and getting really good grades and you take the SAT and you don't do very well, being able to say, I don't really want these considered as part of my application. This isn't really a good representation of who I am as a student. Whether or not the school is optional is really up to them. So it really helps to double check with them. Some schools that are not test optional might have a test optional pathway. Like I mentioned, some schools might use a more holistic review process, but increasingly more and more schools have become and are staying test optional. Another testing policy that schools might have, though, is also called test blind, where you're not required to submit any test scores and they will not impact your admissions decision. So I have worked with institutions that are test blind. Basically, if you send them their test scores, they say, cool, that's great. They don't store the information and they move on. So even if you accidentally sent your scores to a test blind school, they would give you a solid thumbs up and then you look the other direction. So if you accidentally send them to a test blind school, never fear, they don't care. There's also still a good number of schools that will require your test scores. So tests are required to be eligible for admission. So these are the schools that if you do not submit your test scores, you will most likely not be getting admitted. So there are, I know, only a smaller handful of schools that are still requiring the test scores, but as we kind of move on from the pandemic, some schools are changing their test optional policies back to testing required because they see them as a very valuable data point in their admissions process. So really the takeaway is research your school's testing policies as well as their test score ranges to see if you might want to submit your test scores to that school or if it's required. I always like to give the 50% rule of thumb that if you look at a school and you find their middle 50% for their test scores, and you fall in between that middle 50%, it's probably a good idea to submit those test scores because that means that half of their students being admitted are in that bracket. But if you are below that, it might give you pause or maybe think about, do you really want to submit those? But I am going to go ahead and turn it back over to Beth to talk a little bit about some other parts of the holistic review process.
Drew, thank you so much. I want to focus on biographic information. This may feel like it is some of the most simple part of the application, and it certainly can be, but being careful and giving it some thought, I think is going to be really important. So here's a sampling of the kinds of biographical information that will be commonly asked on an application. I believe all of us use either the common application or the coalition application, and so you'll see similar requests for biographic information. Some of it will be required, other parts will be optional. A piece of advice around name: use the name that is reflected on your high school records, because that way information can be matched up more seamlessly. If you do choose to test and you're submitting test scores, oftentimes students may use a nickname in registering for the test, but then their academic records in high school are a fuller name. So if you can use the same name on all of those areas, that's going to be important. The other piece that you're going to be asked for is contact information. So a telephone number or an email address. Again, the recommendation is to be able to use, we often tell students, create an email address that you're going to use just for college. And that way, then all of the things that are college related, you're using that email address. On the next slide, you will see information about activities. So one of the things that if you're early in high school right now, so maybe you're a freshman or a sophomore, this is a really good time for you to begin to make that list of activities so that you can save it along the way and be able to think about all of the ways that you've been involved. When we think of activities, often we go immediately to what do we do in school? And that's a really good place to start. So the things that you're doing, clubs and organizations, sports, leadership, all of those things. But one of the things that sometimes hangs students up when they're filling out activities is you're going to be asked for an estimate of how much time you're involved in and what do you do in that activity. Nobody's going to go back and audit exactly what you put in those fields. But what we're interested in finding out is how much time outside of school a particular activity you're involved in, because there can be a variety of time commitments. But don't limit yourself just to what you do in school. There are a number of community-based organizations. They may be religious, they may be academic focused, they might be professional. We find many students who have family obligations or are taking on a part-time job. Those are valuable activities. The idea of this section of the application is to be able for us to understand how are you going to be engaged in the community when you come to college? How do your interests and how you spend your time outside of high school or the classroom help us get to know you as a person? You know, what are the things that are important to you? If you're later in high school, like a junior, or thinking about applying for college next year, often make the list now, make it over the summer, and then ask a friend or a family member or a school counselor to be able to look over that list with you. Because sometimes they'll say, well, oh, you forgot to list this that you did in your sophomore year. So don't wait until the application is due to be able to do this part of the application. I'm going to turn things over now to John Palmer, who will talk about the next part of the application.
Thanks, Beth. I think I maybe have the most fun thing to talk about because anytime that you ask an admissions officer their favorite part of an application, I'd say probably 9 times out of 10, if I'm a betting man, they would say the essay, because we'd love to hear directly from you. And within the essay, it's where we actually get to hear your voice. If you kind of think about the application, we get to hear about you from your teachers or from counselors or other trusted mentors. We, of course, get to read all of this great information about you kind of in your list of activities. But this is the part of the application where I kind of get to feel like I'm having a conversation with you in some way. An important thing to keep in mind as it relates to essays is that there are admittedly a ton of different types of essays depending on which institution you're applying to. You may be familiar with the quote unquote Common App essays, where you choose from about 7 or 8 different prompts. And that's kind of your traditional college essay. But there are others. Some schools will ask for a personal statement. Other schools will have specific supplemental questions. At Vanderbilt this year, we had 2 supplemental questions that students could choose from. They just responded to one, and it was kind of a short answer response, about 250 words or more. Margie earlier talked about UChicago's supplemental essay, which is always infamously known as super fun to talk about, and I always love reading their prompts every year as well. So know that there are some different purposes depending on the essay. Sometimes if it's something like a personal statement, it's where we get to hear more about your vision for the future. For some specific supplemental essays, we will be really prescriptive with what we want to know. Some schools will say, why our institution? And the purpose of that is so we get a good idea if you're actually a good fit for our institution. So know that there are some different purposes, and of course, a lot of different stylistic differences with those essays as well. I think really the biggest, if I can make one very big generalization, which is always a scary thing to kind of do, essays just help us get to know you a little bit better and a little bit deeper. I always think that that's kind of the depth part of the application, where I can hear a little bit more about your story specifically. Especially going into the summer for students who are rising seniors, one of the most common questions we will receive is, well, what should I write about? Please know that collectively, the 4 of us have read thousands of applications over the years. And I think we'd all agree that thousands of those essays were really, really good. So know that there isn't necessarily one specific thing that we are looking for. I always encourage students to make sure that the topic you're writing about is something that you're actually interested in. I know that sounds like common sense, but sometimes if you're not passionate about a topic, that can come through in your writing. So as long as you are writing on a topic that you're interested in, or you find a way to make it interesting to you, that interest will really shine through within the content of your essay. I'll also mention you can edit those essays until the cows come home, right? So at some point, you got to just press submit on that essay and make sure to send it off to the schools and know that you did your very best work in the editing process. There are some other supplemental components as well. You'll see some quick, short answers if anyone's interested in using the QuestBridge application, for example, which some of our institutions accept. that asks for a variety of really short answer, kind of couple of sentence responses. That just gives us kind of a bite size of into your mind and the way that you think and kind of what you do outside of the classroom. There will also sometimes be portfolios that could be required of your application, specifically if you're applying into any arts-based programs. There may be that portfolio that is required to complete your application. And of course, the resume. Definitely check with each institution to see if they want a resume, and if so, how to upload that. For a lot of us, that list of activities that Beth was talking about earlier within the Common application will actually suffice for kind of a traditional resume. But as you will hear from all of us, always check with the institutions that you're interested in to see what we accept and how we will accept those supplemental documents. I'll turn things back over to Marjorie to round us out with fun things like demonstrated interest.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John Palmer. We're going to finish up with just a few things like John Palmer mentioned. There are a lot of things that we have in common, and then there are a lot of things schools do differently. So my slide is a little more of a it depends kind of slide. So demonstrated interest in school and major selection. I know there was a question, I think from Eli in the Q&A about whether or not majors matter and whether that's a big factor in the application process. So first of all, demonstrated interest. Some schools track it, some schools don't. That's really kind of the do all and be all kind of answer for this. But the idea behind demonstrated interest is some schools want to know if you are really interested in their school, you really want to go there, you've done your homework, you've done your research, maybe you went to an information session or you visited their campus or you interacted with them in some way or another. Schools are very straightforward as to whether or not they officially track demonstrated interest in the application process or not. So that can be one of the many puzzle pieces that are a part of your application. If a school does track demonstrated interest, they want to see you interact with them, whatever that is. And it can be virtual, it can be in person, it can be giving them a phone call. Like it can be anything that shows that you are interested. The last piece is this idea of school and major selection. So not every college or university does admit directly to a major or by major, but some do. And some schools have very, they have really tough programs to get into, right? So the very selective programs, maybe within the school. I think nursing is a really good example of this at many schools. If they have a college of nursing, that often is one of the most selective majors or areas that you could apply to. So that could be a factor in your application process, right? If they're not taking as many students and that's what you put as your major, you better know that that's really what you want to do. So I think the answer again is sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Every school does have enrollment goals. They have a certain number of students that they can take. They have a certain number of beds that students can sleep in. That's kind of where a lot of the idea and the numbers behind selectivity comes from. The idea behind a selective college is just that they receive more applications than they have spots for students. And some schools will even divvy those up according to different majors. So they may receive a lot more applications for one major than another, which means that that major is more selective than others. Again, not every school does it this way. As we talked about the University of Chicago, you don't apply directly to a major. You have a core curriculum that you spend some time in first, and then you declare your major later. So whatever you put on the application as your major at UChicago actually does not really matter. You're going to evolve, you're going to grow, and your academic interest will grow with you. So hopefully that addresses a few of the questions that we saw in the Q&A. We want to spend just a few minutes, like maybe 5 minutes, addressing a few other questions in here before we wrap things up. And I think the first one that I would love to give everyone an opportunity to chime in on it real quick is a question from Eli about career services. So he asks, do students have career counselors? At what point in the college process do your students begin to focus on careers? I will kick us off right there because I think all of us have amazing career services. with that idea of we want you to get great educations and then be able to go out in the world and do something with those great educations. This also addresses a little bit of another question that Eli asked about mental health and support systems. Because all of this is all interconnected. You want to have strong support systems wherever you end up, people who are looking out for you. At U Chicago, you actually come in with 3 advisors. One is a career advisor, that is your dedicated career advisor. They're going to work with you from day one. You have to meet with them actually before you ever step foot on campus, not to decide what your career is going to be for the rest of your life, but to start thinking about what you like to do, what you might want to major in, how do you translate that into opportunities outside the classroom? Do you want to do research? Do you want to do an internship? Like, what is this going to look like? They're the people who are going to help you with that resume, cover letter, things like that. So you have a career advisor from day one. You have an academic advisor from day one. That is someone who's going to help you navigate all 4 years, change your major 5 or 6 times, double major, whatever you want to do. They're there for that. Then you also have your residential advisor. This is your 24/7 person. This is the person you can knock on their door at any hour, at any time. Those resident heads that I talked about at U Chicago, that's your residential advisor. So these 3 people have the same caseloads for the most case, and they are talking to each other, they are talking to you, they're talking to your professors, and they're making sure that you are supported as possible. So I'm not sure who else wants to jump in on this question of support systems, career advising, things like that, but I will turn it over to whoever unmutes themselves first.
I can jump in, Marjorie, and just mention, I think sometimes whenever we think of kind of career pathways, we always think about all of these support services that Marjorie was just discussing, but I think there's also something to be said about the organic pathways that will lead to a future career, whether that be through experiential opportunities, talking about things like research, a study abroad opportunities, internships, co-ops. Of course, each of us have different ways that we make sure that students are getting that experience with faculty or with employers. And I think that you'd probably hear from a lot of students that their future opportunities can be really directly related to those organic experience that they had as well. So a lot to be said for the ways that our schools support you from a structured standpoint, but there's also much to be said about the ways that you were able to get those organic experiences that lead to your next steps through all 4 of our institutions as well.
The last thing that I'll add is all of the commonality of the 16 STARS network campuses is the fact that we may do it a little differently, but part of the commitment that we have to students is this sort of wraparound support that is provided to help students find their pathway. You know, I think one of the stressors that come on to students is they think they have to figure out their careers on day one of college. And we want students to come who are curious and able to be flexible, to have a starting point. But there are many things that students haven't even been exposed to yet that they'll see in college that will lead them potentially to a career pathway that they hadn't even considered. So just be confident that the kinds of support that our institutions provide will help students, figure that out. Might look a little different at each institution, but it's there.
That is a really good transition to a little bit more about all 16 of the institutions. If we did not get to your question, don't worry, we're going to download all of them and we can follow up with you afterwards, but we are right about 10 minutes past the hour. So we do want to wrap things up. However, we are going to be doing monthly sessions just like this with 4 different schools featured each month. And at the end of each session, we're going to talk a little bit about some really important information you need to know about maybe the college search process, admissions, financial aid, support systems, essays, all of these things we're going to cover in more detail. But I highly encourage you to take advantage of the resources that we do have available there. reach out if you have questions. We'll be sending emails and updates as well as, maybe a program opens up that you could apply to and you could go to one of our campuses and spend some time there. Or maybe we have an extra virtual session that you can pop in and ask questions. So we'll have a lot of great sessions coming up over the next coming months. Please reach out if you have any questions, but we are at time now, and I want to thank you all for spending your Tuesday evening with us. You didn't have to do that. We really appreciate it. Hopefully you learned some information that will help you in this process. And we are here to be resources for you. So please reach out at any time. I hope everyone has a great evening and good night.